Neighborhood warfare summers in the quiet American suburbs came without a single breeze. The sun hung high and unrelenting, beating down rays so fierce that the asphalt simmered with heat. Well-manicured lawns stretched in front of every house, neatly trimmed hedges lining white picket fences, crafting an illusion of suburban perfection. Children dashed across yards, their laughter echoing through the air, while adults gathered in shaded porches, seeking what little relief they could find. But not everyone loved peace. Marcus Johnson had lived here for over 5 years. A black man in his early 30s, tall and built like a statue of solid muscle, he had the unmistakable presence of a fitness trainer. His life was simple, structured, disciplined. Every morning, he jogged through the neighborhood, his sneakers hitting the pavement with a steady rhythm. In the afternoons, he meticulously maintained his lawn, trimming, watering, making sure every blade of grass stood at attention. And when evening arrived, he'd settle onto his porch with an ice-cold beer in hand, watching the sky melt from blue to orange. Everything was perfect. Until Richard White moved in. Richard was a 65-year-old ex-cop from Texas. He had stiff silver hair, sharp, calculating eyes, and the unmistakable air of a man who had seen and done things. Years in law enforcement had hardened him, given him an unshakable sense of authority. Even in retirement, he carried himself like a man in charge. And one thing Richard didn't like, people who didn't fit his idea of belonging. The moment he set foot in the neighborhood, he brought with him an icy tension, like a winter breeze slicing through a scorching summer day. From the first meeting, it was clear. Richard didn't like Marcus. He never said it outright. He didn't have to. When Marcus drove past in his black Dodge Charger, Richard's brow creased. When bass-heavy rap music boomed from the car speakers, Richard's lip curled ever so slightly. Small reactions, almost imperceptible, but they spoke volumes. He didn't have to say a word for Marcus to know exactly what was on his mind. The first shot Saturday morning. Soft golden sunlight bathed the quiet streets. Marcus stood in his yard, gripping a garden hose, watching as tiny water droplets shimmered in the light. It was the perfect start to a peaceful weekend. Then a voice cut through the morning calm. "Hey, you should be more careful. Your waters are spraying onto my lawn." Marcus turned. Across the street, Richard stood with arms crossed, his expression a perfect blend of irritation and condescension. Marcus exhaled slowly. This was just the beginning. The spark. Marcus frowned and turned his head. Standing at his front gate was Richard, the elderly neighbor, arms crossed, eyes filled with annoyance. Marcus followed the direction of Richard's pointing finger and saw it. A few droplets from his garden hose, carried by a light breeze, landing near the edge of Richard's pristine sidewalk. Barely anything. A speck of moisture on the pavement. Marcus shrugged, his voice dripping with nonchalance. "Relax, old man. It's just water." Richard planted his hands on his hips, eyes narrowing. "Just water? And who do you think has to clean it up? My yard is spotless. I don't need your mess." Marcus let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head in amusement. "You're mad about a few drops of water? I thought you were from Texas. Shouldn't you be used to floods?" Richard's smirk vanished instantly. His face darkened, his sharp eyes flashing with anger. He didn't respond. Instead, he turned and stormed back inside, but just before the door slammed shut, Marcus caught him muttering something under his breath. Only one word stood out. "People like him." Marcus froze. People like him? What the hell was that supposed to mean? A slow, simmering heat built in his chest, but he took a deep breath, forcing himself to let it go. Not worth it. No point in getting into it with some grumpy old man. But he had no idea. This was only the beginning of a full-blown neighborhood war. The mysterious moving trash can. The next morning, Marcus stepped outside to greet the sunrise. But what caught his eye wasn't the golden sky. It was Richard's trash can. It had moved. Just a little closer to Marcus's driveway than the day before, almost as if someone had pushed it there. Marcus frowned. At first, he chalked it up to the wind, but every day it inched closer. First, it was barely noticeable. Then, it was blatantly blocking his walkway. And one morning, Marcus stepped out and saw it, knocked over, garbage spilling out onto his pristine lawn. His jaw tightened. Enough was enough. He pulled out his phone and shot Richard a text. "Your trash can lost its way." Retaliation. The next morning, Marcus opened his door and nearly stepped on a suspicious-looking plastic bag sitting right on his front step. He frowned, crouched down, and opened it. A putrid stench immediately hit his nose. Dog crap. Someone had carefully packaged it up as a little good morning gift. Marcus felt his blood boil. His fingers curled into a tight fist, his breath deep and controlled as he tried to hold back his anger. But screw it. He wasn't going to let this slide. He stormed across the lawn, his heavy footsteps pounding against the pavement as he reached Richard's front door. Without hesitation, he pounded on it, hard enough to make the wood shake. A few seconds later, the door creaked open. Richard stood there, arms crossed, his face the picture of calm indifference, like he wasn't at all surprised to see Marcus standing there, fuming. "Up early today, huh?" Richard smirked. Marcus didn't waste time with pleasantries. He simply lifted the bag of dog crap, letting it dangle between them. "I know you did this." Richard barely blinked. He simply shrugged, that same smug look never leaving his face. "Got any proof?" Silence. Marcus locked eyes with the old man. 1 second, 2. Then suddenly, Marcus let out a slow, cold chuckle and took a small step back. "All right," he said, voice dangerously calm. "You want to play? Fine, let's play." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Richard standing in his doorway, smirking. The game had begun. The counterattack. The next morning, Richard stepped outside, then froze. His lawn was gone. Instead, a sea of sunflower seeds stretched across his entire yard, covering the grass, the sidewalk, even the steps leading to his front door. And the birds had arrived, hundreds of them, sparrows, pigeons, crows, fluttering, hopping, pecking, shrieking. The air was alive with the sound of flapping wings and deafening chirps. The crows perched ominously on his fence, their sharp beaks tapping against the metal gutter. One particularly plump bluebird had made itself at home right on his car's side mirror, its beady black eyes staring at him as if mocking him. Then, splat, a long white streak dribbled down his car hood. Richard's jaw dropped. "You've got to be kidding me." He grabbed a broom and charged at the birds, shouting and swinging like a madman. But they only scattered for a moment, then rushed right back the second he turned away. The more he chased, the worse it got. And then, one crow, larger than the others, perched itself right on his windowsill. It tilted its head, peering at him with sharp, intelligent eyes, before letting out a long, haunting caw. A chill crept up Richard's spine. He had underestimated his opponent. Showdown. That evening, Marcus sat on his porch, lazily rolling a cold beer bottle between his fingers. The night breeze was cool against his skin, a welcome contrast to the heat of the day. From next door, the distant squawks and flutters of birds still filled the air. Marcus smirked. Then, thud, thud, thud. Heavy footsteps stormed across the lawn. Richard, his face was flushed, his breath ragged with barely contained rage. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Marcus lifted his gaze, unbothered, taking a slow sip of his beer before answering. "Just helping nature thrive, old man." Richard's hand shook as he jabbed a finger toward Marcus, his chest rising and falling with furious breaths. "You don't belong here." The words sliced through the air like a knife. Marcus set his beer down and stood up. His broad shoulders squared, muscles tensed ever so slightly as he took a step forward. Richard, on instinct, stepped back. "Say that again." Marcus' voice was lower now, dangerous. Richard swallowed hard, but he was too stubborn to back down. "I said," he repeated, jaw tight, "you don't fit in around here." A slow, cold smile curled on Marcus' lips. "Oh yeah?" His voice was quiet but sharp as steel. "I've lived here for 5 years. You've been here for, what, 5 months?" Richard's mouth clamped shut, but his eyes burned with unmistakable hostility. Marcus leaned in slightly, voice barely above a whisper. "Careful with your words, Richard. You have no idea who you're messing with." A flicker of doubt crossed Richard's face. This time he said nothing. Marcus gave him one last look, then turned, walking back inside. But he knew deep in his gut, this war was far from over. Neighborhood war, the confrontation. It was raining. The heavy downpour drummed against the rooftops, streaming down in thick rivulets from the porch. Marcus was tidying up in the kitchen when a strange noise caught his attention. Something like a shovel scraping against the ground. He froze. His heart pounded as he stepped toward the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek outside. And that's when he saw him. Richard. That old bastard was hunched over, both hands busy digging a trench right along the edge of Marcus's yard, redirecting the rainwater straight toward Marcus's house. That was the last straw. A surge of fury exploded in Marcus's chest. He stormed outside, moving like a thunderstorm in human form. "What the hell are you doing, Richard?" he roared. Richard flinched, startled. But before he could react, Marcus had already grabbed him by the collar, lifting him off the ground as if he weighed nothing more than the damn shovel. "I've had enough of your shit!" The rain poured down on both men, drenching them in the chaos of the moment. Richard struggled, his face contorted with shock and rage. "Put me down!" Marcus clenched his jaw, his eyes burning with barely restrained fury, his muscles tensed, ready to act. But then he inhaled deeply, steadying himself before shoving Richard backward with a powerful force. The old man tumbled into the mud, gasping for breath. Rain plastered his graying hair to his forehead, but his eyes still burned with unyielding hatred. Marcus leaned down, his voice low, firm and lethal. "If you so much as touch my property again." He paused, locking eyes with Richard, making sure the words sank in. "I won't just be talking next time." Silence. Richard didn't laugh. He didn't argue. He didn't even sneer. He just lay there in the mud, his gaze deep, dark, and unreadable. Marcus straightened up and turned away, heading back inside. But he knew this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. A new chapter. Cold War. The next morning, Marcus stepped onto his porch, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. The sky was crystal clear, and the air carried the damp, earthy scent of last night's rain. He settled into his chair, relishing the rare moment of peace. And then he saw it. Right at the edge of his yard, a long streak of muddy water stretched across the grass, evidence of an intentional act of sabotage. Young blades of grass lay flattened, soil washed away. Marcus inhaled slowly, his grip tightening around the coffee mug. Richard. His gaze shifted to the house next door. There, on his own porch, Richard stood with a newspaper in hand, pretending to read. But Marcus caught the way his eyes flicked over the rim of his glasses, sneaking a glance in his direction. Their eyes met. No words were exchanged, but in that single silent moment, war was officially declared. The silent revenge 3 days later. Marcus woke up, stepped outside, and froze in place. Right there on his lawn, a small wooden sign was firmly planted into the ground. The words painted across it made his eyes widen. For sale, contact for price. Marcus raised an eyebrow and walked up to the sign, yanking it out of the soil. Beneath it, a folded note was clipped in place. Just helping you find a more suitable place to live. Or a short, sharp laugh escaped Marcus's lips, dangerous and edged with amusement. "Oh, so that's how you want to play it, old man?" 3 hours later, Richard returned from the market, grocery bags in hand. As he climbed the steps to his porch, he reached for the doorknob, only to recoil in disgust. Something cold, something slimy, something wet. His breath caught as he glanced down. A dead fish, jammed right onto the doorknob. The foul, pungent stench hit his nose instantly, making him step back in reflex. His face darkened, his fingers tightening into a fist so hard his knuckles turned white. With a sharp motion, Richard flung the fish aside and turned his head toward the house next door. Marcus stood there, leaning casually against the doorframe, arms crossed, a lazy smirk playing on his lips. "How's it going, neighbor?" Richard didn't answer, but in his eyes, the fire was burning now. War escalates. From that night on, everything became a silent battle. Every night, Marcus heard strange noises outside. In the morning, he would find his trash bin overturned, garbage bags shredded as if wild dogs had torn through them. The next night, Richard woke up to the blaring sound of a car horn right in front of his house. He rushed outside only to see an unmarked car idling in his driveway, headlights glaring. The moment Richard stepped forward, the car revved its engine and vanished into the night. From his porch, shrouded in darkness, Marcus took a slow sip of beer, amusement flickering in his eyes. And it wasn't over. One morning, Richard opened his front door to find a package waiting on his porch. He frowned. He hadn't ordered anything. But the moment he opened it, a swarm of live cockroaches burst out, scattering across his doorstep. His furious curses echoed through the neighborhood. Meanwhile, from behind the fence, Marcus simply smiled. Breaking point, a late night. Marcus was deep asleep when a loud crash jolted him awake. Thud! He shot up instantly. Something had been knocked over. A shadow moved in the dark. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. Reaching under his pillow, he grabbed the knife he always kept there and silently slipped out the back door. A cold gust of wind sliced through the night as he stepped outside. And then he saw him, Richard, standing in the middle of Marcus's yard, a shovel gripped tightly in his hands. And at his feet, Marcus's motorcycle tipped over, a deep scratch gouged into its side. "What the hell are you?" Richard spun around, breathing heavily, his face twisted in pure rage. "I've had enough, Marcus," he roared, voice shaking with fury. "You think you've won?" Marcus tightened his grip on the knife and stepped forward. "I don't think I know." Richard flung the shovel to the ground, his eyes burning with something unhinged. "Then come on, kid." A deathly silence fell. The only sound was the wind howling through the trees. Then, without warning, Richard lunged. Marcus reacted instantly, dodging to the side. Richard's punch barely missed his face. Seizing the opening, Marcus grabbed his collar and slammed him hard against the fence. Crack! Richard groaned in pain as his back hit the wooden boards. But instead of retreating, he grabbed Marcus's arm and yanked him down. The two men grappled, breath ragged, muscles straining. Then, with a swift twist, Marcus forced Richard's arm behind his back and pinned him down onto the dirt. Richard struggled, but Marcus held him firm, breathing hard, eyes dark with warning. "This is your final warning," Marcus hissed, voice low and lethal. "If you ever touch me, my house, or anything of mine again." He twisted Richard's arm just enough to make him wince in pain. "You'll regret it in ways you can't even imagine." Silence. Then finally, Marcus released him, shoving him aside. Richard staggered to his feet, his expression no longer wild with anger, but something deeper, something far more dangerous. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his house. Marcus stood still, watching him go, a ghost in the night. For a few days after that, things quieted down. No more petty tricks, no more retaliation. But Marcus wasn't naive enough to believe Richard had given up. No, the old man was simply waiting. And Marcus hated waiting. 3 nights later, late at night, Marcus sat on his couch, gun resting on the table in front of him, eyes locked onto his security camera feed. After Richard had trespassed into his yard, Marcus had installed extra cameras. And now he was watching every dark corner of his property. Everything was quiet. 10 minutes. 20. An hour. Nothing. Marcus exhaled, standing up. Maybe tonight would be peaceful. And then, a flicker of movement on the screen. His head snapped back toward it. The backyard camera. A shadow passed by. Fast. Too fast. Marcus clenched his jaw. He grabbed his Glock, tucked it into his waistband, and silently stepped out into the night. The air was ice cold. Wind rustled through the trees. Marcus moved slowly, carefully, every step precise. The darkness swallowed everything, but his eyes had long since adjusted. He stopped, listening. Nothing. But he knew someone was there. Then, a faint click, near the fence. Marcus spun instantly, raising his gun, aiming straight ahead. "Come out." His voice was steady, unshaken. No response. But he could hear breathing. 1 breath. 2. Then, from the darkness, a whisper. "You don't belong here." A cold shiver crawled down Marcus's spine, but he didn't blink. "Richard," he growled. Silence. Marcus took a slow step forward, gun still raised. And then, bang! Something crashed behind him. Marcus whirled around, heart racing, gun ready. But there was nothing. Nothing but shadows. And Richard was gone. The hunter. The next morning, Marcus checked the security cameras. He rewound the footage from the previous night, playing it back in slow motion. And then, he saw it. Right before Richard's shadow vanished, something was off. The old man didn't run. He didn't step back. It was as if he dissolved into the darkness. Marcus sat up straight, a deep sense of unease creeping through his gut. Richard wasn't just an annoying old neighbor anymore. No, he was something more. And Marcus needed to uncover the truth before it was too late. Psychological warfare. Marcus couldn't deny a simple truth. Richard wasn't just a nosy old man. He was cunning, persistent, and maybe a little unhinged. And Marcus? He wasn't one to back down either. If Richard wanted to turn this into a psychological war, then Marcus was ready to play. The plan begins. The next morning, Marcus woke up with a wicked idea. He stepped outside, picked up his phone, and placed a special order. 10 small mirrors, 2 high-powered subwoofer speakers, a motion-activated lighting system. 3 days later, the package arrived. Marcus spent the entire afternoon setting everything up. The mirrors were scattered throughout his yard, reflecting eerie glimmers of light once night fell. The motion sensor lights were primed to flash on at the slightest movement. And the speakers? Marcus hid them in the bushes, programmed to emit some very special sounds at exactly 3 a.m. Richard's nightmare 3 a.m. A faint, eerie moaning echoed from Marcus's bushes. It was the sound of cats mating, edited to sound like someone sobbing. Richard shot up in bed, eyes wide with panic. He yanked the curtains open and saw strange, distorted reflections flickering across Marcus's yard. The dim glow from the streetlights twisted the images, creating an otherworldly effect. Then cutting through the eerie silence, "Richard, I see you." The warped voice crawled out of the speakers, dragging through the night air. Richard's breath caught. His heart nearly stopped. He stumbled back, mumbling, "No, no, that's impossible." And then suddenly, flash! The motion lights flared to life. A shadow, something, someone, loomed on his wall. Richard let out a blood-curdling scream and tumbled backward, hitting his head against a wooden cabinet. Thud! The next morning, Marcus sipped his coffee, eyes fixed on Richard's house. The old man would appear soon. Marcus was sure of it. And right on cue, the front door burst open. Richard stormed out, hair a mess, his face still haunted by the previous night's terror. "Marcus!" he roared, jabbing a finger in his direction. Marcus raised an eyebrow, his tone perfectly calm. "Good morning, neighbor." Richard took a deep breath, face turning red. "What the hell did you do?" Marcus shrugged, a slight smirk playing on his lips. "What do you mean? You're talking about the strange occurrences?" Richard clenched his teeth. Marcus took a slow sip of coffee, then said, completely deadpan, "Maybe it's karma." Richard's nostrils flared. "To hell with your karma. I know what you did. I swear if this happens again." A sudden drawn-out meow came from the bushes. Richard flinched, nearly jumping out of his skin. Marcus waved a hand dismissively. "Probably just a cat, old man. Relax." Richard clenched his fist, but he had no comeback. Defeated, he turned on his heel and slammed the door behind him. Marcus leaned back in his chair, savoring his victory. The game was far from over. But this round, he had definitely won. Lessons learned. A few days later, the whole neighborhood had heard about Richard's haunted house. People whispered. Even the local kids started teasing him. "Hey, mister, I heard your house is haunted." "Shut up," Richard snapped. But there was nothing he could do. As for Marcus, he walked away with 3 valuable lessons. Some people aren't worth reasoning with. The only way to handle them is to play smarter. If someone doesn't respect you, don't hesitate to turn them into a joke. Most importantly, never mess with someone who has too much free time and a creative mind. Marcus chuckled to himself, taking a sip of his beer. The war wasn't over yet, but for now, he was winning.